This is The Law Matters. Of course it does. Welcome once again. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this long-running program continues to provide legal information, relevant examples, and practical assistance to help you with the law matters. A better understanding of the law puts you in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and at times your business. As we present various topics, you may decide to handle some issues yourself. If you do decide to enlist professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and as a result, so will they. Our goal, of course, is to save you time, money, and to achieve the best possible results. Also, as always, we want to welcome and thank once again Attorney David Bizarre from the Bizarre & Associates law firm in East Providence, who continues to provide legal information and his insights on all of the topics that we cover. So today, we'll discuss selling a business. It's one of the most significant challenges businesses and shareholders confront. And here's news: it's never too early to begin preparing for the sale of it and consider what factors are going to make a difference as you prepare for it. How does your business potentially stack up to potential buyers? And what does selling a business really entail? What is due diligence? It can be quite complex, from market appraisals to valuations, getting that paperwork in order, the obstacles that are sometimes unspoken, sometimes not so obvious, all impact on what your sale price might be and how long it might take for you to sell something. What should you do? What should you enlist others to do? What does a lawyer do anyway? You certainly want to make sure that your business is priced correctly and you have all of your ducks in a row. So let's break it down. It's quite complex. What do you do first? What's it all about, David?
Well, there's a lot of different factors that can go into considering selling a business. First and foremost is, what type of business is it that you're selling? And is it important to keep the possible sale confidential so that your competitors can't go to your customers and say, oh, you know, they're selling, or whatever it might be that could interfere with your ongoing business? So the first thing I would say is make sure if it needs to be confidential, it stays that way. So if you're going to speak to someone like a business broker or an investment banker, depending on the type and size of the business, that there's some kind of non-disclosure agreement or some confidentiality agreement, so that the whole idea of you even looking into selling the business is kept quiet and confidential. Is
that something that could be a do-it-yourself move, or does someone need to enlist a professional right at that moment?
Oftentimes you would probably start the process with an attorney and have an attorney draft something for you. If you're doing it without an attorney, which you can do, it's very possible whoever you're consulting with, the business broker or the investment banker, might have an agreement that they would send over that you could then have your lawyer look at for you. So depending on the type of business you're selling, that might be an important first step.
Okay. What other things need to happen? How does the process play out from what you've seen in your perspective?
Next step is, what is the valuation of the business and how do you do that? So depending on, again, the type of business and what are you selling? Are you going to be selling shares of the business, so selling the stock, or are you selling the assets of the business? And those have different implications. So we'll talk about that too. But the first thing to figure out is, what is the business worth that you're selling, so you can make a determination of, well, and I guess let's go back a step. Why are you selling the business? Is it that you just want out, you've done it long enough, there's no next generation coming along to run the business is doing great, now is the time to sell, the business isn't doing well, I want to get out. So I think knowing the purpose and reason for selling it is important to determine what steps you take next. But in any event, what steps you would take next is to determine the value of the business, so you can decide whether it's the time for you to sell or not.
I know at the top of the segment I mentioned it's never too early to start thinking about it, and I do things to help businesses plan for, grow, and sell businesses as well. And often businesses are in a position that is not ideal when, say, the owner or the principals are not in an ideal situation, maybe even an illness. So to prepare for as much as you can and keep things, your records in order, certainly market the best you can, do what you can to keep your business at its highest possible value, makes sense to start thinking as soon as you can about what best positions your business. So what kinds of things do you find that your prospects who want to sell the business, what kinds of things are they able to do, and what do they need to have others do?
So certainly the first and most important thing you need to do is run your business as best you can so it's as valuable as it can be. And keeping, if it's a business that has an inventory, keeping a good track on what the inventory is and the value of the inventory, tracking your sales, keeping your financials in order, keeping your legal documents in order are all important. But the most important is to make sure you're running the business as successfully as you can.
And we mentioned the importance of financials. So if someone's considering, maybe they're just putting their toe in the water to see what their business might be valued or appraised at, do they go to an accountant first, because an accountant might have a sense of that? There are certain financial records that we can talk about. Or do they go to an attorney first to say, let's get the paperwork ready? You can't do a purchase and sale if you don't have an idea about what the price might be, but how do you find that people are most likely to set up those processes when they're thinking about it?
I think the first step would be with an accountant. So if you have an accountant who's regularly doing the books of the business, I'd meet with the accountant. If you don't have one, I'd get one, let them come in and look at everything. And again, what they're looking at are different valuations of the business. There's the book value of the business, or the balance sheet value, which is what are the assets worth and what are the liabilities. Then there's the valuation that might be based on what kind of earnings the business has. I think the term is EBITDA. So earnings before depreciation.
Interest. Taxes, it's
taxes.
Depreciation,
Yep.
And the A is amortization.
Amortization. So once you add all of those numbers back in, and in a family business or a closely held business, there are actually other numbers that I think should be added back to the EBITDA.
Such as?
Such as those family members who are taking a salary that really don't need to be taking a salary because they're not doing very much for the business, if there are any. Of course, that doesn't happen, but of course it does. The other expenses that might be run through a business that may or may not be necessary. For example, cars, cell phones, if there's someone on health insurance that wouldn't be necessary to continue those kinds of expenses that might be more, I'll call it personal in nature than business in nature.
Fluff.
Yeah. And so once you get to that true EBITDA with those add backs, then you need to know what type of percentage, or multiple I should say, the business might sell for. And now, is the business worth more being sold as an ongoing business, or is it worth more based on the balance sheet? And those are certain things that you need to figure out both with an accountant once you know what the numbers are, and then depending on the size of the business with either a business broker or an investment banker.
So if someone's gone to an accountant, perhaps discuss something with the lawyer that maybe you'll be the one to do my purchase and sales, maybe you'll be the one to help with the negotiation. I understand that depending on the financial health of a business, the multiples could be from 2 to 10. That's a pretty wide span. Yep. What happens next? Does someone look for a broker who's going to assign that number? So the asking price?
Yeah, you depending again, like I said, on the size and type of business, you might work with a business broker who can help give you a valuation based on the multiples that they've seen your type of company sell for before. If it's a bigger business and the expense of an investment banker is worth it, they are very good at packaging the business and knowing different places where it can be sold, besides just a competitor or somebody else who might be interested in that type of business. So again, what I would do is start with the accountant, especially if it's an accountant that is familiar with the sale of businesses, and they'll have recommendations for where you should speak, being a business broker, investment banker, or some other type of person who can help with the sale of the business.
You mentioned earlier, probably this is a good time to discuss that there are different ways that people look at the business, selling shares, assets. Why don't you describe that distinction?
So it's important for a buyer in particular to know what they're buying. So if they're buying the shares, then they're buying the business. So that means if you're going to buy the company, you're buying both the assets and the liabilities. And there can be a downside if you're in the type of business where there could be lawsuits that are potentially waiting out there in the weeds. There's a lot of due diligence that needs to go into that before a buyer should and would be willing to buy the shares of the company rather than the assets of the company.
Does the potential buyer need an attorney to help explore or vet or ferret out what those potential risks might be? And are they equipped to do that, as well as having an attorney represent the seller? Yeah,
so you absolutely would probably, if you're going to buy it in that kind of fashion, need to have an attorney who can work with, hopefully, the attorney for the sellers to get full disclosure of everything that's going on. Are there any lawsuits pending, potential lawsuits? You need to know, based on the type of business that you're buying, what those possibilities and potentials are that a lawyer might be able to help figure out for you. Oftentimes, a buyer is going to want to buy just the assets and leave all the liabilities with the company, the previous company, the seller's company. It's oftentimes, and this becomes a tax issue for the seller. It's what are the capital gains if you sell your shares rather than the assets? What's the benefit of selling the assets? And are you stuck with liabilities? And what are the nature of the liabilities that you have?
If you're the lawyer representing someone in that situation, how do you counsel them? What do you say?
Well, you need to look into all of the issues first. What are the possible liabilities? What are the financial situation of keeping the liabilities and having to pay those out of the sale of the company or otherwise? And what risk or exposure do you have as the seller if you sell the assets and not the liabilities, so to speak?
And if you are talking to that prospective seller about going into a deeper dive in all of these issues, are you also likely to be the one who would be maybe changing what that proposed selling price is on the one hand, or might you be the person who would be negotiating on behalf of that seller in the second place?
Yeah, so you would be negotiating the deal. And so are there going to be, if you're perhaps doing the stock, are there going to be holdbacks or money in escrow to make sure that there are any potential liabilities that haven't been uncovered, that there would be enough to cover those potential issues? And if you're going to cover those potential issues with escrow or something else or some other holdback, what are the terms and how are they going to get paid back to the seller once the period of time has expired? There's a number of different ways you can structure a deal, and that's really something that the attorney should be working on in negotiating with the buyer's attorney for you as the seller. There are other issues too. Perhaps you own real estate. Is the real estate part of the sale, or are you going to keep the real estate? And if you're keeping the real estate, are we going to negotiate a lease to the buyer so that you have income on your real estate investment that's separate and apart from the business you're selling? So there's a number of different issues that really can be looked at and need to be dealt with.
How about those who are employed by the company? Say the one who owns the company, employed maybe with a heftier salary than he might otherwise have, and also the employees. Is there protection for them? Is there a legal way to protect them? Thoughts about that, David?
Yeah, so that's actually an important issue on both sides of the equation, both for the buyer and the seller, and perhaps for different reasons. For example, the seller may want to protect some key employees or family members with an employment contract as part of the deal so that they're going to be continued to be employed. Maybe you're right, maybe their salary was a little bit heftier than it should be and it's going to get reduced to a more fair market value, but it's a negotiation that's part of that whole deal. The buyer needs to look at both the purchase price that they're paying for the company and what they might be paying for employees that they may not necessarily want. On the other hand, there's a very strong possibility that the buyer may want to keep some key employees, and they may want to negotiate an employment contract with the people they want to keep before they're willing to close on the deal.
Address, if you will, the potential that the person who's selling the business wants to be out of that business for whatever reason. Let's say it's not health reasons, but later on is anticipating going back into the business. Obviously, if you're selling the business, the prospective buyer is not going to be excited about you closing one door and opening the similar door of a similar business a day, or a week, or a month later. So there might be some time period that needs to pass. It's 5 years, or we've talked about restrictive covenants before. Is that something that becomes part of a purchase and sale agreement, or is that part of something that you negotiate as a lawyer on behalf of the seller? How does that work?
That's absolutely part of the negotiations of a deal when you're trying to sell your business. We talked about a whole show of non-compete clauses and restrictive covenants and all of that. So rather than repeating that whole thing, what I would say is absolutely be prepared if you're selling your business because you want out to have to agree that you're not going back into the business in some competitive form or fashion by signing an agreement to that effect. Within
5 years, is that a reasonable time? Is that something that you might consider, or does it need to be less or more depending on the size of the business and the territory?
Yeah, I think it's dependent upon exactly the nature of the business and what time frame makes sense to not have the buyer concerned that you're going to be working either for a competitor or going back into business and competing for your own customers back. So the time frame would really be based upon what the nature of the business is.
And speaking of time frame, what do you find is a reasonable time period that it may take for someone to sell a business? Obviously, some very quickly, some not so. What would be a reasonable range?
Right. It really depends on how big the business is, the type of business, and the marketing of the business once you've put a package together. I've been told that for some businesses, 6 to 9 months is a reasonable time to get a package together, market it, and find a buyer. Of course, there'll be some time once the purchase and sales agreement, so to speak, is entered into for it to close, but that's a time frame I've been told can be reasonable.
Let's talk about something you mentioned earlier that started with the non-disclosure agreement. That sounds like a very reasonable way of protecting people. In anyone's industry, Rhode Island, I guess, in Massachusetts, or any place else, industry is what industry is. People do talk. And it's very hard at times to keep a lid on some facet of it that would keep it completely undercover till such time that someone puts it on the market. What actually can be done when you know people who are in business, they often are talking with vendors, they're talking to clients, they're talking to suppliers, they're talking at industry networking events. How realistic, or how do you advise or counsel people when they're in that corridor of thinking about selling? Should they suddenly not have any discussions with any of those folks? Should they suddenly not go to the networking meetings when in fact it might be to their advantage because maybe out there is a prospective buyer that could expedite this?
I would continue to operate and do business as I always do business. Anything you change could be a start of a rumor that may or may not be true that you don't need out there. I would just continue to do business as I always did. If you're just thinking about selling, that's really not even a step towards doing it. So, you know, if you're at a marketing deal or whatever you were talking about where you're dealing with a vendor or somebody and they say, hey, you're thinking of selling? My answer is no, I'm not. Not until you know that you're going to do it. Now, as you said, you're in a different position. If you are going to sell, then you might want to say, hey, you know, I'm selling the business. Do you have any interest if it's somebody that might be able to buy it or know anyone who might? Because the wider the net you can cast, the better the deal you might be able to make. But until you've decided to sell a business, then you haven't decided to sell it. So you just keep doing business as you always would.
So in many occasions, and it wasn't just because of COVID, market conditions, economy, many, say for example, within manufacturing, have found that their businesses have suffered and struggled. And whether they thought of selling, going out of business, or whatever they did, their businesses suffered. As a result, people who are suppliers, people who are customers, get to know a little bit about that. The minute that happens, how many have said, when I've been a business consultant and a marketing consultant, I can tell that people are waiting for my business to continue to decline so they can snag it for a song or the least possible price, or maybe just pick up the customers because you're out of business. What can be done to fend that off, David? What can be done to make that the best possible scenario for the prospective seller? Is pulling the trigger right away, saying, yes, we're selling it, and maybe snag someone then, and maybe they won't wait till you just die a natural death? What do you say to that, David?
If you can build your business back up, if there's a way to do that, that's your best way of fending off those who are waiting for your decline. And so, as you say, vendors, they'll know because they're not getting paid. So
exactly.
Whatever you can do to make sure that you're paying your vendors on time, that'll send a signal that, well, they're not so bad. If it's a 30-day term, they paid within 30 days. I don't know what you're talking about, they paid me. So if you're able to operate in that fashion, that's the best thing you can do. And then build it up so that you have something strong to sell.
Along those lines too, if you had been marketing or advertising your business, had a sales staff, yes, you could save some money if you eliminated the sales staff, but also you're perhaps cutting off your nose to spite your face and limiting your potential to continue to build sales. So would you also, in the same vein, consider suggesting to someone that they maintain their marketing, their advertising platform or program as best they could? Would you continue to suggest that?
If it's a viable business, then that's what you need to do. I think there was a saying that I've never really liked, but you have to spend money to make money. Sometimes that's true. Salesforce, if you're in a business where that's your income, that's your bloodline, you need to have a great sales force. So if you need to spend more money on the sales force, then that's what you do. You'll be happy to know if you need to spend more money on marketing, then that's what you need to do. You need to do what you need to do to generate income and drive your business forward.
How might the sale of a business look in terms of how you'd package it? When you think there's an opportunity to sell it to people who are currently managers or people who are, if not, maybe they're mid-level managers, if there's someone within the company who could sell it, they know the ins and outs of the business, how does that change the complexion or the process of the sale?
Oftentimes sales to the management is much different than a sale to someone outside, because what you're looking at is how much income does the business produce. Therefore, how much money can the managers or the employees or whoever the group is that's going to buy it borrow to pay and generate the income to pay the loan off, and how much money can they raise on their own to put towards it. So oftentimes what you're doing is you may not be selling the whole business. You may be selling a percentage of the business so that you're still an owner of it and you're still on the board and still helping to oversee what's going on, but the managers now have bought equity into it so that they're trying to build it. So maybe at some point down the road, either all of you could sell out for a bigger profit, or they can afford to buy the rest of your shares.
Would you, as a lawyer, in addition to putting, or while putting a purchase and sales agreement together, and you're looking at people who are within the company doing, would you be more likely to structure it so that they can amortize it over time, take in lieu of salary to finance? Would you be looking at that, or is that something that just an accountant would do, or would you do it together?
You probably would work together with an accountant to determine what the numbers are, but the lawyer would put together the legal structure so that the documents are in place that carries out, this is the amount of money that you're going to pay up front, this is the deal, this is the exit strategy if there is one, those types of things.
And while there's a lawyer, while there's an accountant, we touched on the idea that there's also tax implications. Do you find that we need a separate kind of accountant who is schooled in the tax impact, which is very different from the normal course of business? How do you play that out, David?
Yeah, usually it's an accounting from a bigger type of firm, but if you have an accountant who does, is a 2, 3, 5 person, whatever number of accountant firm that knows the business structure and those types of things, they can be perfectly fine to handle it. It's really just having an accountant knowledgeable in that area.
A tax accountant is paid a fee, a lawyer is paid a fee, a business broker, are they paid fees? Are they paid percentages? Is it paid on contingency? How does that usually work, David?
So it depends on what level of business broker / investment banker you're using. It can be an investment banker that gets paid a very large fee. It could be a business broker who will work entirely on a commission, and then there's some hybrid forms in between.
What kind of range might someone expect to encounter in terms of percentages?
So 5 to 10%, depending on the size of the business. For a broker, fees can be hundreds of thousands of dollars if you have a big business and an investment banker. It could be $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 with a hybrid form of a commission that might give you credit for whatever fees you paid or something in between.
How does one go about finding the right kind of lawyer, the right kind of business broker, the right kind of person to value the business? How does that generally happen?
So it depends on your current professional that you deal with. If you have a trusted accountant that you know, they oftentimes will know lawyers that do this kind of work. They'll know business brokers that do this kind of work. If you have a lawyer that's been doing your business work, you could start with the lawyer.
Sounds right. And if there's a chance working with a lawyer and there's a confidentiality agreement in place, how can a lawyer help that prospective seller from encountering a competitor who is romancing him but not really honestly interested in buying, but more interested in doing something that's more unseemly? How do you really protect someone when they've signed a non-disclosure, but?
Well, oftentimes, I do this from the perspective of a business broker. They'll put together a list of people that they think would be interested in your business. They can't go to that, you should have an agreement that they can't go to anybody until you've looked at the list. And then you can tell them, no, this is either someone I don't want to sell to, I don't want to do business with, or someone I don't want even to know I'm selling at that point. So you can tell the business broker or the investment banker that there are people on the list they have to take off.
And suppose you just plain don't know that that person wasn't above board and honest. You entered into a quick conversation with them and it isn't going where it should. They've snitched. They've not honored that disclosure agreement.
Well, you would want them to sign that agreement, and then they violate it. You'd want to have to potentially sue them for the violation of the agreement.
And you as a lawyer, that's one of the things that you do to help minimize the risk of that seller.
That's the whole point of having the agreement.
Thank you. We certainly have covered quite a few details about selling a business. We hope that it's been helpful to you. We hope you will continue to stay tuned to The Law Matters. It matters to you. Thank you.